of eternity comes a song of paradise to the lovers and the severed ones, the poor ones and the kings. He sings a song to wet the hearts and lifts our drooping wings. A dervish, a prisoner, a father of the poor, he has drained the cup of sorrow that all may live in joy. With every passing day he takes a dagger to his chest. With trembling hands and weary bones he lays his head to rest. And when the day turns to night, he longs to take his flight, whispering goodbye to all the lovers. And the fever drains his life, one last breath, one last goodbye. He is a king, and his kingdom will not die. He is a king, and his kingdom is nigh. His footsteps slowly fade, his slippers by the bed. One more smile to cheer the friends, no word is left unsaid. Oh, the fire in his eyes is gone, he's summoned to his home. And in my heart I see the king ascending to his throne. And when the day turns to night, he longs to take his flight, whispering goodbye to all the lovers. And the fever drains his life, one last breath, one last goodbye. He is a king, and his kingdom will not die. He is a king, and his kingdom is nigh. I will not forget thy bounties when you are gone. I will remember thy days during my days, and I pray that I will be so steadfast in your love that my heart shall not waver. I will not forget thy bounties when you are gone. I will remember thy days during my days, and I pray that I will be so steadfast in your love
O God, my God, shield thy servant from the evils of self and passion. Protect them with the watchful eye of thy loving kindness. From all rancor, hate, and envy, shelter them in the impregnable stronghold of thy care, and safe from the darts of doubtfulness, make them the manifestation of thy glorious sign, illumine their faces with the fulgent rays shed from the day spinning of thy divine unity. Gladden their hearts with the verses revealed from the holy kingdom. It strengthens their loins by their all swaying power that cometh from thy realm of glory. Thou art the all bountiful, the protector, the almighty, the gracious. Abdul Baha.
We don't hear you, Farhan. You can check your microphone after.
O Lord, thou art the remover of every anguish and the dispeller of every affliction. Thou art he who banished every sorrow and setteth free every slow, the Redeemer of every soul. O Lord, grant deliverance through thy mercy, and reckon me amongst thy servants of thine, as have guide, salvation. Depart.
Oh God, refresh and gladden my spirit, purify my heart, refresh and gladden my spirit, illumine my powers, I lay all my affairs in thy hand, in thy hand. Thou art my guide and my refuge. I will no longer be sorrowful and grieved. Thou art my guide and my refuge. I will be a happy and joyful being, O God. I will no longer be full of anxiety, nor will I let trouble harass me. I will not dwell on the unpleasant things of life. I will not dwell on the unpleasant things of life. Thou art my guide and my refuge. I will no longer be sorrowful and grieved. Thou art my guide and my refuge, oh God. Thou art more friend to me than I am to myself. Oh, I dedicate myself to thee. Oh Lord, I dedicate myself to thee. Oh Lord.
happy and joyful being, O God.
Allah, friends, welcome to our 914th program of Talari Aran. We are so proud to announce that tonight we are with Dr. Ahdieh. Really is our honor to have him tonight. I thought that maybe that would be a good idea to introduce him a little. I found his background, and I like to say about this because it's very, very important, I think. Dr. Ahdieh is the Dean of Texas A&M University School of Law and served as a Vice President for Professional Schools and Programs at Texas A&M University, a respected legal scholar and academic leader. He has played a major role in the rapid rise and national recognition of Texas A&M Law School. Dr. Ahdieh earned his undergraduate degree from Princeton University and his JD from Yale Law School before joining Texas A&M. He held several leadership and teaching positions at Emory University School of Law. His professional work focuses on corporate law, administration law, international law, and legal system in Russia and post-Soviet countries. He is widely recognized for his scholarship, leadership in legal education, and commitment to innovation and the interdisciplinary professional programs. With that said, really, I welcome Dr. Ahdieh. I unmute you, and so thank you so much for participating in our program.
Well, greetings, Fred and Alapa friends. Wonderful to be here, and an honor to be with you all and part of this wonderful program. You said how many? This is which episode?
914 of them.
Okay, good.
Tonight.
So hopefully I don't do anything so terrible. It's the last of the 914. Hopefully that's just the first 914. So it's wonderful to be with you all. As you saw from the topic, my agenda tonight is to share some reflections on lessons from the Baha'i electoral process. Obviously, this is a topic of great interest to us. Really, I would say today, anywhere in the world, that one is the topic of elections and how elections function, and where they're working and not working, and what are the challenges, are incredibly timely. Some of the issues, there are lots of them in the United States in recent years. There has been lots of concern and discussion about worries about election interference. Whether we can trust the elections, whether people are, stealing ballots or doing these things. Who knows how much there's truth or falsehood to this, and that's of course not my topic tonight. But even independent of any of that, there's lots and lots of very interesting discussions and debates around elections today. A few of the other critical topics that you hear a great deal about: the influence of money in elections. We know today that money plays a significant role. If you have to pick who is more likely to win, whether someone is a better speaker, whether someone is in the right party or the wrong party, whether someone has better positions or worse positions, all of those things are probably, if we're being honest, dwarfed by if the other side has $100 million to spend on advertising and other things, that's likely to drown out anything. So issues of money and its role in elections are obviously an important topic. Partisanship. The level of partisanship is greater than ever. We talk about this and we see it on the news and so on and so forth. But it turns out even the political scientists, when they look at the data, what they find is that the level of partisanship has become incredibly extreme in the United States and really other parts of the world as well. We see party line voting very commonly, that people say, I don't even know who these candidates are, but I'm voting for them because they are on my one party or the other party, whichever one I favor. More broadly, it's become kind of the prism, partisanship has become the prism through which we evaluate everything. So once I know whether someone, is a Republican or a Democrat or something else, that tells me whether I agree with them or not on, 20 issues that otherwise I might have felt differently about. So partisanship is a second big issue. The role of personality is another one. This isn't unique to this day. For a long time, we've known that what the candidate looks like and how charming they are and how articulate they are can have a huge impact on how people are voting. And based on recent data, in sometimes it's the case that those personality factors dwarf even party affiliation as a determinant. And then more broadly, there's the question of merit. Do we think that the very best people are running for elected office in the United States and other parts of the world? Or do we think that the very best people say, we don't really want to have anything to do with this. I'm going to be a doctor. I'm going to be a business person. I'm going to be a lawyer. I'm not going to go into politics, even though I might be very effective because of all of these negative dimensions. So all these things are important. Today, what I want to share with you, and again, I will begin with a little bit of kind of introduction. For those on the Zoom who may not be familiar with Baha'i administrative processes. So I'll just take a couple of minutes at the beginning to outline that. But then I want to focus on whether there are insights from the Baha'i electoral process, Baha'i elections, that we might borrow and learn for elections otherwise. My premise is not that we should elect the president of the United States using the same process as we use in Baha'i processes. I don't think that's the case, that we can just copy it. But I do think there may be lessons or principles, the insights that we can draw from the Baha'i processes that might be informative of how we should think about our electoral processes generally. All right, so one last note before I kind of jump into sort of some thoughts to share with you. And of course, again, I'll share some thoughts, and I hope then we'll have time for questions afterwards and discussion. But for those of you who are interested in delving into this topic more deeply, Arash Abizadeh is a Baha'i and a professor at McGill University, and really independent of his Baha'i work on Baha'i elections and Baha'i politics, Baha'i perspectives on politics. He is one of the brightest political science and political theory professors out there, and he's written on Baha'i elections. And I owe much of my thinking and knowledge to the work of Arash. And so if you're interested in reading more and studying more, I would commend to you Arash Abizadeh's work at McGill. Okay, so the basic Baha'i framework for elections, or Baha'i administration broadly, let me start with and again, and most of you will know, but again, for those who are relatively less familiar, the basic Baha'i administrative structure can be understood to consist of a series of multiple layers of elected institutions, each of which is keyed to progressively larger jurisdictions. So in most jurisdictions, most countries around the world, that involves local spiritual assemblies, which are tied to individual municipalities and localities, a national spiritual assembly, a body that's for the entire nation, whatever the nation or state is, and then what we call the Universal House of Justice, which is a global governing institution. All of these are elected. All of them have 9 members, and all have this name of spiritual assembly, or again, houses of justice. Now, there's a few exceptions to this. I don't think we have to go into necessarily, although we can in Q&A. There are a few jurisdictions that have elected regional councils as well that break up the country into pieces. But let me leave those aside for the moment. What is interesting with those exceptions is that across an incredibly broad array of countries and jurisdictions with different histories and cultures and political contexts and education levels, this Baha'i framework that I just described to you is common across all of them. And that itself may be telling. I mean, the idea that there is something in the simplicity and the nature of the Baha'i electoral process that means it works in the Congo as well and effectively as it works in Germany, and it works just as well in Russia as it does in the United States, and so on and so forth. All right, so what's the electoral process for these? And again, I apologize for those who know this very well, but in case there are those on the call who are less familiar, let me share it. So starting at the local spiritual assembly levels, remember, 9-member elected body keyed to a given city or a given town or jurisdiction. The notion is that all Baha'is of 21 years and older within that city and locality are eligible to vote in the election of 9 individuals. With any other adult, any other individual of 21 years or older being eligible for election. The elections happen by plurality. A plurality vote is sufficient. And there is a requirement to vote for 9 individuals. In other words, I can't choose to vote for 3 or 6 or 4 or 7. I have to vote. I'm required, as a matter of the process, to vote for 9 individuals. So that is the local spiritual assembly. The national spiritual assembly process. So the Baha'is resident in each of a given number of units. So we take the relevant national nation state. We divide it up into electoral districts. Each of those electoral districts, again, anyone 21 years and older, anyone eligible to vote, elects a delegate to go to a national convention where those delegates collectively, they vote on the membership of the National Spiritual Assembly for that jurisdiction. Again, by plurality vote, and again, the requirement of each of those delegates to vote for 9 individuals. Finally, the Universal House of Justice, this body governing all the Baha'is around the world. In that case, members of the National Spiritual Assemblies vote for 9 individual members, again, subject to those same rules. Just again, by way of note, before I turn to the actual electoral process, because of the way we vote with 9 individuals, there can be ties. If there are ties in the results, so you have more than 9, ultimately have the largest number of votes, there is revoting between the remaining individuals, between whoever remains, unless one of those individuals is clearly part of a minority community, and a minority is defined by that particular jurisdiction, right? So it may vary from place to place. But if one is clearly a member of a minority group, in that case, that individual is considered to have been elected to the relevant governing body. Okay, so that's the administrative structure. Last kind of piece of background is, what about the actual voting process? What does the actual voting process look like? This is where, for those of us coming from the United States or most other countries, it begins to get interesting because it is very, very different, of course, than what we're familiar with. So to begin, and maybe most notably, there are no candidates. Nobody puts their name forward, or if you look at the guidance closely, or can withdraw their name. So everyone who is an adult in that community, everyone 21 years and older, is a candidate, right? There are no individual candidates who are nominated or whose names are put up or so on and so forth. There are no parties, of course. There are also no slates. So there's no I'm going to vote for this group of 9 because we've agreed that those are the 9 we're going to do, or these 3 or 5 or 7 or whatever else it is. In fact, again, there's no nomination at all because everyone is potentially eligible. No electioneering or campaigning is a third point. Of course, there's no electioneering. And again, if you look at the guidance closely, electioneering includes don't vote for me. The not voting for me is considered to be electioneering just as much as you should vote for Fred. Or the like. Number 3. Number 4. No discussion of personalities. The Baha'i guidance is very clear that we should not be talking about personalities. The community should consult about what are the criteria that are important to look for, but it should not be about personalities. It should not be about individuals. It should be broadly defined. Number 5, secret ballot. So the ballot is secret. This is not an uncommon phenomenon, but it's not universal. Outside of in the general electoral context. But the ballots are secret ballots. Number 6, the Baha'i writings describe the duty to vote in Baha'i elections as a sacred duty and responsibility, a sacred duty and responsibility. As you are well aware, here in the United States, only about 50% of the eligible voters actually vote in even presidential elections, let alone if we go to local elections and other elections, it's even lower. For Baha'is, the notion of participating in the Baha'i electoral process, the notion is that it is a sacred or a spiritual duty or obligation or responsibility that we have. And number 7, in terms of the voting process, again, the Baha'i writings talk about that the election should take place in an atmosphere of prayerful reflection. Prayerful reflection. Interestingly, this one, and we'll come back to this a little bit later on too, if you actually have voted in general elections, there is something of that quality. When you go to vote in general elections in the United States, for example, there is no campaigning within the room. It's generally quiet. People are not to talk to one another in that room, right? You go into a little box or with a curtain or whatever else it is, and the notion is that you're supposed to be in there almost in a prayerful state, and reflect on how you wish to vote. So there is something of that, you might say, in the electoral process. So that's the basic Baha'i election process. Again, I'm glad to answer questions about that further along or when we get to Q&A. But my goal for what I want to share with you before we turn to questions is to talk to two broad points of analysis. When we look at that Baha'i electoral process, I'm going to talk to you about two broad points. First, I want to talk to you about the values that are reflected in that Baha'i process, and that are advanced by it. What are the values that are reflected and what are the values that are advanced? And second, I want to talk to you about the electoral goals or outcomes that the Baha'i election process seems to advance. So first, the values that it reflects and that are advanced by it, and second, the goals or outcomes that it seeks to advance or achieve. So starting with values to begin. So what are the values, again, that are reflected in the Baha'i electoral process that I just described to you, and what are the values that it seeks to advance? So a few that I would highlight for you, that I would emphasize, call to your attention. The dignity of individuals, I would suggest to you, is probably the most the broadest kind of dimension of the values that the Baha'i electoral process seeks to. The dignity of individuals. Various dimensions of that, I would tell you. But I would start with what we think of as the traditional elements of freedom and equality. Freedom and equality. So what do we mean by each of those in the context of the Baha'i electoral process? So first, in terms of freedom, the Baha'i writings place a great deal of emphasis on the value of participation. So I mentioned some of that a little bit earlier. Another quote from the Baha'i writing talks about the vital importance and necessity of the right of voting. I'm repeating, the vital importance and necessity of the right of voting. The Baha'i writings also talk about the importance of voting one's conscience, voting one's conscience. That is in part the reason that all must be eligible to be elected, and the reason why we don't have nominations. It's also the reason why we don't have term limits in Baha'i elections, in Baha'i administrative institutions. In fact, even the plurality provision, the idea that you don't have to secure a majority to win, it's sufficient if a plurality of the voters, if the largest number, even if not a majority, support you. All of that is to advance, in some sense, the ability of an individual to vote their conscience. If there's nominations and I'm only allowed to vote for these people, if there's term limits and I'm no longer allowed to vote for these individuals, if I'm pressured to change my vote so that we can move from a plurality to a majority, all of those in some sense are taking away my freedom to vote my conscience. Also perhaps related to the true freedom, all this is perhaps related to the true freedom of who to choose, is the emphasis on prayerful reflection and silence. The idea that only in prayerful reflection, in silence, am I able to truly exercise my freedom of conscience. Only in that setting am I able to truly determine what it is that I wish to prioritize. What about then equality, this further dimension of the dignity of individuals? So first, equality is demonstrated in the fact that all vote. All of those 21 years and older are able to vote. And they are called to vote in the Baha'i writings without prejudice. The Baha'i writings talk about the need for us each to vote in the Baha'i elections without prejudice. The distribution of these districts that we have in the election of the national spiritual assemblies is also intended to produce equal representation of districts in those elections. So the idea is, we would talk about it in the United States as one man, one vote. The idea is we want proportional representation, so everyone has comparable representation in the election of the National Spiritual Assembly. So those two elements, freedom and equality, I think are important critical elements of the dignity of individuals as a value that we want to produce. But in the Baha'i context, I would suggest, beyond freedom and equality, which are very familiar to us in the democratic context and the context of the United States generally, I would add to that the notion of nobility. Nobility as another aspect of the dignity of individuals that the Baha'i electoral process emphasizes and plays out. So let me say a little bit about that one because it's perhaps less familiar than freedom and equality might be. Here, the notion is grounded in the Baha'i concept of the inherent capacity of each individual for spiritual perfection. The inherent capacity of each individual for spiritual perfection. But also the implied possibility that follows from that of not achieving that perfection. So by definition, if we can get there, it means we can also not potentially get there. In the hidden words, Baha'u'llah has written, "Noble I made thee, wherewith dost thou abase thyself?" Noble I made thee, wherewith dost thou abase thyself? Part of the broad goal of Baha'i electoral processes, thus, I would say, is to draw out that nobility. Again, another passage from the Baha'i writings says, "Regard man as a mine rich in gems of inestimable value." Regard man as a mine rich in gems of inestimable value. Electoral processes in the Baha'i election context, I would say, are meant to draw out those gems, to bring forth that nobility. How does that manifest itself in the Baha'i electoral process? So to begin, you might think about freedom, the freedom that I'm saying as this, initial, one of the aspects of the dignity of individuals. Freedom is the source of the right to participate. Because we have freedom, we have the right to participate. Nobility is the source of our responsibility to participate. So freedom gives us the right to participate. The need for human nobility that we recognize in the Baha'i teachings is the source of our responsibility to do so. That's, I think, why there is so much emphasis, as I said earlier, on individual Baha'is' responsibility to participate. You can think of this as part of our pursuit of our spiritual potential. Hence this sacred duty to participate, right? So this idea that if it's a sacred duty, it is part of my elevating my soul and my spiritual existence when I do that. Again, some additional passages about that. The Baha'i writings talk about the sacred duty to take part conscientiously and diligently in the election, the consolidation, and the efficient working of his own local assembly. That's the responsibility of each Baha'i individual. And again, in another place, the vital importance and necessity of the right of voting, a sacred responsibility. That principle of nobility as another aspect of what the values that the Baha'i electoral process seeks to advance is also reflected in what I think of as the spiritual dignity of the process. Again, we talked about the qualities of prayerfulness, of silence. The writings talk about the need to vote after meditation and reflection. The other passages in the Baha'i writings talk about in the Baha'i election context of a rarefied atmosphere of selflessness and detachment. When the election is happening, it's to be a rarefied atmosphere of selflessness and detachment. The lack of discussion of personalities that I mentioned earlier, I think also ties into the value of nobility and the related practices of having a secret ballot, no campaigning, no parties or factions or coalitions, no nominations, so on and so forth. It's interesting that the Baha'i writings very prominently and forcefully call for or emphasize the value of consultation. Generally, the Baha'i writings describe consultation as an incredibly powerful and incredibly valuable thing. The notion is that it is an essential device for communal engagement and collaboration. Notably, in the electoral context, that's true as well, just not about individuals. So we should have consultation and we should engage as a community in what are the criteria that are important? What are we looking to accomplish in terms of who is elected to the assembly? But it should not be about particular individuals, and it should not be intended to sway the votes of others. It should not be designed to influence others' voting. Why are those aspects of the Baha'i elections counseled by the principle of nobility, by the value of nobility as a goal of the Baha'i electoral process, as part of one of the values it seeks to advance? Part of it might be the strong prohibition of the Baha'i teachings against backbiting. So Baha'i teachings talk about backbiting as the most grievous of sins. It's compared, as you know, to murder. You've been forbidden to commit murder or adultery or to engage in backbiting or calumny. The notion is that when we talk about individuals as good candidates or bad candidates, or this person was a good member or a bad member, or we should vote them off or vote them on, that undermines that principle of, or cuts against this principle of backbiting. But you might say, couldn't we limit the consultation to positive things? Couldn't I say, Fred should be elected because he's awesome and he organizes this wonderful meeting and everyone comes and learns a great deal and so on and so forth? Or maybe it'd be okay to backbite in the context of elections. You might say that, look, in some settings, if I'm a lawyer, if I'm prosecuting someone and sending them, I'm going in front of a jury and talking about all the terrible things this person did, and therefore they should be found guilty. No one would say, I'm not being a good Baha'i because I'm backbiting, right? That's an appropriate context in which to do that. So one might say it's almost naive that in the Baha'i context, we don't allow backbiting, we'll call it, in the context of elections. But that, I would suggest, points to a separate issue, and that's the notion of policy versus personnel. And the Baha'i writings talk about this in various places. Shoghi Effendi has talked about this. The goal, the idea is, should be to focus on policy. We should be engaged with questions of policy, and we should resolve those questions of policy through consultation. If we want to be able to do that effectively, though, it is invaluable to separate it from personality, because the moment you tie policy to personnel or policy to personality, it becomes hard to have a thoughtful consultation about the policy and the principle, because it gets inseparable from the individuals who are involved, and that becomes a distraction. One last point on nobility as one of the values that we seek to advance. At least since Plato, the great Greek philosopher, at least since Plato's Republic, his most important work, there's always been some notion out there that those who are best suited to holding positions of leadership are those who don't seek those positions. That might be also understood to impact the structure of the Baha'i electoral process. By definition, those who wish to be nominated, those who accept a nomination, so on and so forth, are potentially not the ones who are most likely to be effective in those roles. That too then becomes an aspect of nobility. All right, so what broadly the value of the dignity of individuals is a value we seek to advance in the Baha'i electoral process, as manifested in a focus on freedom of individuals, equality of individuals, and the nobility of individuals. So beyond those aspects of dignity, which I wanted to most importantly highlight, one might think of an additional value of the Baha'i electoral process, of value it seeks to advance, as being the value of unity and solidarity in the Baha'i community. In some ways, this follows naturally from the notion of dignity as an important value. So the notion is that if we believe in the fundamental moral and spiritual unity of all human beings, if we believe that fundamentally we're united, and the resulting value of each individual lies in attending to the interests of others in the choices they make, having a Baha'i electoral process that looks like this, in some sense, is a tangible manifestation of our commitment to unity and solidarity, right? By voting through secret ballots, by everyone being a candidate, by everyone being able to vote, In essence, we are behaving as a unit, as a community. We are behaving in unity and solidarity in a way that advances certain values that are a priority. Lastly, beyond dignity and the aspects of dignity I shared, freedom, equality, and nobility, beyond unity and solidarity as values the Baha'i electoral process advances, I would identify the degree of justice and fairness of the elected institutions and of the society as a whole as a final set of values that the Baha'i electoral process can be understood to advance. You might understand this as going beyond the benefits of attending to the interests of others to a moral responsibility to do so. So it is a good idea for me to attend to the needs of Fred and others on this call. That's a good idea for our community. But there is also some notion that as a matter of justice and fairness, I have a moral responsibility to do so. So in the Baha'i electoral process, the requirement that all individuals must cast an equal number of votes, every individual who votes must vote for 9 individuals, in some ways reflects that. The idea that it is critically important that there be justice and fairness and equality. We have a moral responsibility to do that. And that's why I can't vote for 3 and you for 5 and someone else for 7 and someone else for 9. If we think about the proportional representation again that I mentioned earlier, that in the selection of delegates, the notion is that every, whatever the number is, 5,000, 10,000 Baha'is have a delegate, and it's equal across each group of Baha'is sorted around the country. That too reflects this notion of justice and fairness and equity. Okay, so those are some of the values that I think we seek to advance through the Baha'i electoral process. What are the outcomes then? Second part of what I want to share. What are the outcomes that the Baha'i electoral process then seeks? I want to talk about some of these. And then from there, then I want to talk about some of the applications of this to the real world, not the real world, to the secular world of elections. And then I'll stop there and open it up for questions and discussion. So outcomes. We talked about values. What about outcomes then? One might start with the individual qualities that the Baha'i electoral process is meant to achieve in terms of membership of the local spiritual assemblies, the national spiritual assemblies, and the Universal House of Justice. The Baha'i writings suggest that those who are elected should possess, and again here I'm quoting, should possess the qualities of unquestioned loyalty, of selfless devotion, of a well-trained mind, of recognized ability, and mature experience. Elsewhere, the writings say the individuals elected should be faithful, sincere, experienced, capable, and competent. And finally, in another place says, upon election, the individuals elected should seek to win by every means in their power the confidence and affection of those whom it is their privilege to serve. Indeed, not only the confidence and the genuine support and respect of those whom they serve, but also their esteem and real affection. And I want you to think about that for a minute. In 2 different places, the Baha'i writings talk about that there should be affection for those whom we like. Not just confidence, not just trust, but affection for them as well. So those are individual qualities that the notion of when we think about a successful Baha'i election, the notion is that we have elected individuals who have those individual qualities that I just shared. But there's also institutional qualities that are worth emphasizing. The 4 institutional qualities that I would flag. One is diversity, and I'm going to say more about that one in a minute. Second one is representativeness. Representative is some notion that the length and breadth of the community is in some ways reflected in or that is represented in the membership of the assembly. Minority presence, remember the electoral provision that when there's a tie, it goes to the minority. So that's an institutional outcome or institutional quality we're trying to achieve. And believe it or not, there are also provisions about the representation of youth in particular, that the younger generation should be represented when possible on our elected institutions. So I said a few words about the second, third, and fourth. Let me now say a little bit more about diversity, including because of course, diversity is a subject of much debate in the country right now. So diversity, of course, is a core value within the Baha'i framework. Again, a few passages from the Baha'i writings tell us that diversity contributes to the beauty, efficiency, and perfection of the whole. Consider this. Diversity contributes to the beauty, the efficiency, and the perfection of the whole. So the notion is that a group is more efficient by virtue of being diverse, more diverse. Elsewhere, the Baha'i writings say, when the diverse shades of thought, temperament, and character are brought together under the power and influence of one central agency, the beauty and glory of human perfection will be revealed and made manifest. And then I have a longer passage I'm happy to read in Q&A if you want to hear it, about the notion of unity in diversity, which again, for the Baha'is on the call are familiar, but for any others, this is the notion that we find unity in the very fact of our diversity. The diversity, we talk about a beautiful garden of diverse flowers. If all the flowers were the same, it would not be nearly as beautiful as a garden that's comprised of different flowers. But there's unity in that beauty and that shared commonality. All of that emphasis on that principle of diversity may help to explain, among other things, the practice regarding ties. Like, so why is it that when two individuals tie, that we give a preference to someone who is clearly from the minority population in that jurisdiction? Okay, so we talked about individual qualities that we want to advance. We talked about those 4 institutional qualities that we wish to advance. I want to talk a little bit about a few other outcomes that the Baha'i election seeks to advance as well. First 2, I'll do together: the ability to correct problems and general improvement over time. Okay, so we're talking about sort of what institutionally we hope is accomplished with our Baha'i electoral process and the results of that process. We hope that we have a structure in place by which we can correct problems. If there's things that are not working, we are able to address them and correct them. We hope that we can, over time, get better and better, make general improvements over time. These can play out both in terms of individuals and in terms of the collective. The fact that we use annual elections in the Baha'i electoral process, so there's, most elections are every 2 years or 4 years or even 6 years. In the Baha'i electoral process, we elect the local spiritual assemblies and the national spiritual assemblies, although not the Universal House of Justice, every single year. That could be explained by, if this is a mechanism to solve problems, if this is a mechanism to produce improvement over time, you might do elections every year. This also suggests a further institutional outcome of turnover over time. As being an institutional value. So that here the idea, I think, is that change is good. It's good to have fresh outlooks, fresh energy, so on and so forth. So we don't go as far as term limits, right? Because term limits, again, back to where we started, would limit the freedom of individuals to vote their conscience. But there is value placed. There is an outcome that the Baha'i writings talk about of turnover over time, that it is good to have new blood, new energy, new perspectives, so on and so forth. One last outcome that I want to mention in terms of institutional outcomes is to foster public-spirited value, to foster public-spirited virtue. So here the notion is that elections can serve an educational function. If you know, Alexis de Tocqueville was a French intellectual who wrote about the when the United States was first established, first became an independent country. He lived here in the United States, and he wrote a book called Democracy in America. And he talked about this educational function of elections. The idea that when you have elections, it gives citizens a sense of responsibility. It gives them a sense of ownership or responsibility of the jurisdiction. So, and again, when we think about the lack of nominations, in some sense, that reflects it. If there were nominations, I could just say, sure, I'll just vote for whoever they stick in front of me. By contrast, where everyone is eligible, what is my responsibility as a Baha'i? I have to go and I have to think about every single member of my community and reflect on who would be a good candidate. Who is it that I should vote for? Again, a quote from the Baha'i writings: "The practice of nomination has the great disadvantage of killing in the believer the spirit of initiative and of self-development. Baha'i electoral procedures and methods have indeed, for one of their essential purposes, the development in every believer of the spirit of responsibility." So when we vote in this fashion, where we don't have the luxury of saying, I'm going to vote for whoever Fred says, or I'm going to vote for whoever the slate is, it gives me the sense of public virtue, public spirit of responsibility that I have. The same principle is true of the lack of parties or slates. I can't just say, I'm going to vote for the Persian slate, or the American slate, or the old people slate versus the young people slate, or whatever else it is. In political elections, think about this with regard to straight ticket voting, where I say I'm voting for all the Republicans or all of the Democrats. That, it turns out, is not wise. And notably, in the United States today, fewer and fewer jurisdictions actually allow that. When I started voting now, whatever, a long time ago, you could go into the ballot box and you would hit one switch and it would push down all the levers for all of the Democrats. Or you do the other switch, all the many jurisdictions have gotten rid of that because they want to instill this same sense of responsibility. You can vote for all the Republicans or all the Democrats or all the Green Party or all the whatever, but you have to do them one by one is the notion. Okay, so we've talked about the values, we've talked about the outcomes. Let me just take a few minutes, and then Fred, you'll tell me as we get close to when you want me to stop, and we'll turn to questions about what are some of the applications of this. And I'll talk about a few, and then if we run out of time, then we can turn to questions, and maybe I'll say more about some of them later on. But it's worth noting at the outset, or again, reiterating or emphasizing again, that I do not have any notion that the United States would be better if we adopted the Baha'i electoral model, or that Texas, where I live, would be better, or the city of London would be better if they adopted Baha'i electoral processes. But again, there may be aspects of what we've been talking about that potentially might have relevance and application that we might borrow from. So let me start with perhaps a strange one that seems kind of odd. So we talked early on about the role of prayerful reflection and silence. Prayerful reflection and silence. Given the spiritual emphasis of prayerful reflection and silence, that might seem like an odd one. But as I mentioned earlier, it turns out by making the places of voting quiet, dignified, private, so on and so forth, we are in some sense creating this atmosphere of prayerful reflection and silence. So thinking about how in our electoral processes we can do more of that may enhance the quality of voting that we see. The more, even if you don't think of it as prayerful, if you just think of it as reflective and silent and quiet and the like, that may be valuable. Another one that may seem like an odd one to bring to bear, sacred duty and responsibility. The notion of a sacred duty and responsibility to vote. Notably, as it turns out, that is exactly how we used to talk about elections, even here in the United States. That was the frame when we talked about even the word sacred was not uncommonly used, that we have a sacred duty to exercise the franchise, to exercise this democratic opportunity that people died to preserve, died to build, so on and so forth. We do not do as much of that as we used to. We don't engage much in civic education. We don't teach people why it's important to vote, why democracy matters, what is democracy, and we don't really talk about it much either. But there still is some of that. You will go to an election, and you'll see there's an adult, a father or a mother, and they have their 5-year-old or 6-year-old with them. And they bring them with them and they take them into the voting booth for them to see. During the pandemic, during the COVID pandemic, tons of news coverage during the elections, during that period of time, in which they showed these crazy long lines, right? Because again, you couldn't have too many people inside, so on and so forth. And so just these lines that would go on for hours and hours and hours. And when the news reporters were covering that and reporting it, they were in essence reflecting the sacred duty, the sacred responsibility to vote. So could we do more with that? What might it look like? So we could do more civic education, right? It might be important in democratic nations and democratic countries to emphasize civic education more. We might change our notions about accessibility, right? So again, so thinking about how easy we make it to vote or not easy we make it to vote may be a part of this. Oregon, the state of Oregon, every eligible voter gets a book, a very thick book that goes into detail, gives detailed information about every candidate, about every proposed constitutional amendment, every proposed referendum, has multiple pages of description, and they're crafted as here's the pros and here's the cons for each of those. You can imagine we might do more of that, more education about what we do in what is happening in elections. Lots of debate around in-person voting versus mail-in ballots. It's sort of an interesting question. You could imagine a world in which, as convenient as it is to have mail-in ballots, it does take something away from that sacred duty, right? The idea that, no, I have to find a way to get there and to vote, right? Now, of course, there's a trade-off. We might decide that it's not worth it because there are people who won't be able to vote in that circumstance, but it may be possible. What about more complex elements of the Baha'i electoral process? So think about the lack of parties, the lack of candidates, lack of campaigning, discussion of personalities not being appropriate. We might at first say, excuse me, we might at first say that given the scale of our elections in the secular world, in the real world, you couldn't really analogize those. For example, how would we identify candidates? If I had to write down who should be president, including everyone in the United States, that would be very difficult to do. But it turns out that a lot of elections, when people go into the ballot box, they don't really know who they're voting for already. So that may already be a bit of a problem. So perhaps the better approach, then rather than think about that, is to go think back to those values that are being reflected in advance and the outcomes that are being sought, rather than trying to adopt a specific provision or a specific thing. So if you think back to those values of the dignity of individuals, the nobility of individuals, it may be useful to think about how we would reflect those more fully. Let me suggest a couple of those, and then I'll stop and open it up because I think you're probably tired of listening to me. So in terms of some of those outcomes, so we talked about outcomes to be accomplished. How would we accomplish those without the discussion of personalities, parties, and the like? So to begin, you could imagine a greater degree of institutional transparency. So there is not a great deal of consultation, right? It is not the case that we engage in significant consultation. Now, think back to, we talk about ancient Athens and where democracy originates. And the notion was that everyone would gather in the town square. Now, we're too big now. There's no square that could hold us all. But you can imagine at the level of our communities, of the neighborhoods in which we live, right? There being more of that dialogue, consultation, and discourse. You could also imagine, that universal participation and engagement, that Baha'i principle also has application and might be brought to bear. So how are we investing as countries, as communities, as individuals even, in ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to vote, understands what they're voting on, is literate enough to be able to vote, so on and so forth. So each of those principles might well have application to what we do. So for example, there are lots of jurisdictions where there's what's called a clear language requirement. So you cannot phrase a proposed constitutional amendment in a way that we all couldn't understand it. There is a requirement of voting that the language has to be clear. It has to be accessible and understandable. There are jurisdictions, I mentioned Oregon, but there's others too, where there's a requirement to distribute information. Again, education, an emphasis on education may be part of it. The role of news and media might be different as well. We might imagine requirements that employers have to give employees time off to vote. Now, you might be surprised to know that that is actually the law. but we don't actually advertise it. We don't share it. People don't realize it. And so as a result, people don't exercise their vote. But you could imagine doubling down on that in ways that reflect this Baha'i principle of universal participation, universal engagement. So I'm glad to sort of in the Q&A talk more about some of these implications and applications. I do not have, again, I'm going to repeat the last time, I don't have any notion that we can resolve those problems that I began with through application of specific Baha'i principles. But I do think, again, there is something to be learned, even though there will be questions. And I'm going to end with kind of two broad questions and then open it up for you. One is how much cultural variance we should expect in our electoral process. So remember, what is interesting about the Baha'i process is that it is the same in a village in Zambia as it is in New York City. Identical. There is no difference in those voting procedures. Interesting to think about. Does that translate into secular elections as well? And finally, then, does the secular context perhaps dictate a completely different set of values, a completely different set of outcomes? I hope it was clear from what I shared that I think that dignity of individuals, freedom, equality, unity and solidarity, even nobility and the like, all of these are values that I think are attractive and important values, even independent of any religious or spiritual context. But one might question that. Likewise, in terms of the outcomes, one might do that. But if that's not the case, then I would say we do well to study the example of the Baha'i community, which has managed to do what it has done over the last 150 years, for lessons that we can learn. Okay, let me stop there. I've gone probably too long already. But happy to open it to questions and to discussion and any conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ahdieh. It was really, really wonderful. And thank you so much for really for selecting this topic, because really this is a very important topic, and there's a lot of questions around regarding the Baha'i elections, and really you draw it very nicely that how it is and how it should be. So the thing is, we do have the friends. I think if you have any questions, you can raise your hand, but I start with my questions, and then if you raise hand, I will stop mine because I have 2 or 3 questions, and then if you have any questions, I can bring you between mine. Dr. Ahdieh, you mentioned that the other elections, the money, position, party, bipartisan, and all the stuff is a part of the package, but in a Baha'i election is not. Well, the thing is, I think, I'm not sure, but I think that probably money and position is not one of the laws, and in the other election is the matter of if somebody has a position or has a money, maybe the people think that he is a successful person, he has performed well, and then his position, he fought for that position, he got to the position because he is really is a very aggressive person to do things, or just making the job done and all the stuff. And I think subconsciously the people, they are tend to elect those kind of people. Even in the Baha'i communities, even they see that if somebody is competent and is wealthy and has a good position, or they want them to be as a part of the assembly as well. So but one thing that is, this is not my question, this is actually the comparison between these two, but the question is, on other type of election, they are coming and they are well advertising, or just pro or against the individuals, that who he is or she is, what is the background, and this and that. In Baha'i election, we don't have those. But, okay, that's fine. But the thing is, sometimes in communities, of course, I'm talking about the larger communities. I'm not talking about the communities only 8, 9, or 10, 11 people. I'm talking about the I'm talking about the communities who they have a good number of the Baha'is and they want to go to election, and then some competent people exist and they are in the community, but they have not been recognized. Maybe they are not an active Baha'i, but they are well qualified to be a member of the assembly to compare with the others. We have to anyway, right here is the comparison. Some people they are well knowledge and then have a leadership and all those stuff. Some people they don't. But how that one is going to work out? If we grow more and more, as I said, the thing is, if the number of Baha'is is reduced or is not so many, is understandable. But when we have a large amount of a number of Baha'is, like 2,000, 3,000, 5,000, something like this, in order just recognition of those individuals with the capabilities is lacking. As a matter of fact, is missing there. That's my opinion.
Yeah. So let me give a couple of reactions. Exactly kind of among the challenges that are not just questions for the relevance of Baha'i elections for secular elections out in the world, but also how sustainable is the Baha'i framework? So I'll say a few things that have been identified or suggested or highlighted over time. So one is, it turns out that if we are operating effectively, perhaps would say, as Baha'i communities, one might hope and expect that there are various channels by which individuals are drawn into service, are drawn into visible service and impactful service that allows individuals to see them in action. Now, of course, I want to say that very carefully because that could begin to sound like electioneering and campaigning, right? Or even nominating. That, yeah, we're going to put this person on the area teaching committee or on the X or the Y or Z with an eye to them getting known and becoming visible for purposes of them getting elected. There is that risk, if we're being honest with ourselves. But I do think, again, at least some of the Baha'i principles, if we stick with them, potentially also act as a guard against that. We actually see this in the phenomenon of now that we have these regional Baha'i councils in the United States, which again, as I mentioned early on, there are now in some jurisdictions these regional level institutions that exist, right? Not all countries, but some. That very often, not always, but very often, the individuals elected to the National Spirit Assembly have been drawn from the ranks of those. At the level of the Universal House of Justice, there's the International Teaching Center. Oftentimes, members of the International Teaching Center at some point come to be elected to the Universal House of Justice. Again, I'm going to repeat for the second time, but it is important to be careful about that because otherwise there is a risk that, again, that it collapses into, okay, we're doing it now and then these are our successors kind of thing. But I do think that hopefully becomes a mechanism by which that plays itself out. And I think Arash is the one who did this research that I mentioned at the beginning, but may have been someone else, did some looking at what were the vote counts of the successful individuals elected to national spirit assemblies. And what they found that was interestingly over time, as the Baha'i community has grown, it is not the case that we don't see that phenomenon. It's not the case that the 9 who vote have more votes. They actually have less votes when they win. So it means that through these other mechanisms, other individuals are gaining visibility as well. So that's the hope, at least, I would say. Oh, let me say one other piece is also remember, there is nothing fixed about the New York City Baha'i community or the Dallas Baha'i community or the Los Angeles Baha'i community. One could imagine a time coming when Los Angeles has 12 local spiritual assemblies, each of them with 1,000 Baha'is within that jurisdiction. So there is nothing in the definition of the local spiritual assembly boundaries that requires that it operate at the level of the full municipality. It could be broken up in other ways as well.
Thank you so much. As a matter of fact, when you mentioned that Plato just mentioned that whoever does not wants to seek the position, probably that would be the best person for
That's
that
exactly
position.
right.
There's a lot of individuals with a good quality, but they don't want
Absolutely.
to participate. So we have
Absolutely.
to- So yes, okay. I'll go. I have a couple questions, but I'll go with Said Naimi, please. Just okay. I unmute you, Said John.
Alaba Dr. Ahdiye, thank you
Hello,
very much
Sajjan.
for this talk. How
Very
are
good.
you?
Yes, very good to see you.
Beautiful talk. Few things came to my mind because I heard that you were kind of comparing sometimes the election in the United States at general with our election. It's not comparable, but I saw that you were bringing some parallels. What are the things that we can compare? My question is that do you think in the future Baha'i election, the system of Baha'i election can be adopted in the whole world? And if that's the case, right now, we don't have in the greater world the appointed branches that we have in the Baha'i faith. So, how do you foresee these things can work in the future?
Very good. Let me talk about they're intertwined, obviously, but let me do them kind of in the order you said. So again, I would emphasize that I would say if you asked me wearing my professor hat, do I think that we will elect the president of the United States eventually through the same process as we elect Baha'i local representatives? I don't think so. In fact, it's not even intended for that. The Baha'i electoral process is a process for electing Baha'i administrative institutions, not for electing executive leadership. And obviously, you know that in the Baha'i administrative, in the World Order of Baha'u'llah, Shoghi Effendi talks about that there will be Baha'i institutions, and parallel to that will be executive and legislative and judicial institutions. And I don't see it as, you know, this process has to be used for those as well. But I do want to again emphasize what I said. It is not the case that when we design electoral processes in the United States, we spend a great deal of time thinking about the nobility of individuals and what electoral process will elevate the nobility of individuals. It is not the case that we spend a great time of thinking about how will our electoral processes foster unity and solidarity within the community. It's not the case that we reflect a lot on the importance of secret ballot, although we do generally use secret ballots in elections, but we don't really reflect on a thing. Yeah, so that's where I think if you ask me, do I think that there are aspects of Baha'i elections that will, in due course, so I'm not going to say a number of years, but in due course, will appear in the secular electoral? I think the answer is yes, and I can say that's as a positive matter. As a normative matter, I also think that would be good, right? Because I think the disregard for human dignity and human nobility in our electoral process is part of why our electoral processes produce terrible elected officials, right? As opposed to elected officials that we would be proud of and pleased with, and so on and so forth. So I actually do think that there is significant learning to be had. We just have to get past we have to copy it, right? It's worth noting in that regard, though, that there was a research paper done. I can't remember if it was funded by the United Nations or some other international organization that looked at different election models around the world, and ultimately concluded that the best one was the Baha'i electoral model. Now, they didn't go so far as to say, and therefore Germany or Russia or China should adopt that model, but they did explain why, as a matter of the structure, that would be a good model. Now, the appointed branches. So the appointed branches, again, for anyone in the call who's not familiar, so I talked to you about the elected administrative order. There is parallel to that what we call the institution of the learned. These are individuals who are appointed at every level, again, to serve as individuals who provide counsel and guidance and so on and so forth in their individual capacities rather than as part of a collective. And they do not have administrative decision-making responsibility. Their function is pastoral and counseling and advising and so on and so forth. So I actually don't think that is something that's beyond the pale in terms of general elections. If you look at the Baha'i writings about the role of kings and queens, in some sense, it's that, I think. I don't think that the Baha'i writings that talk about the power of the king and queen are intended to say it would be better if we went back to monarchy. That's not how I interpret them. I do think that there is some notion that there are these individuals, and it could be, at the top level, could be at other levels as well, who have, by dint of their experience, their wisdom, the respect that others have for them, they have the capacity to kind of counsel and advise and lower the temperature and redirect and so on and so forth. That's important. So I wouldn't exclude. I don't think it has to take the form of kings and queens, right? You could imagine other forms that would take, right? But again, you could imagine a world in which I'm focusing on elections, so I didn't focus much on that. But if we were trying to design a more effective system, you could imagine at the state level, there is a parallel set of individuals not subject to election, not part of the legislature or the collective kind of institutions of this sort, but that have this kind of advisory function that they serve at different levels. So
One step, yeah, thank you. One step back. If we consider that today's election, outside election, like general election that we have, we know that's corrupt. It has a lot of flaws, and I'm thinking that initially the flaws were not there. Unfortunately, because of lack of certain rules, these flaws have come into the play. So I'm just wondering that, initially the intention was pure. It was not like that. Am I correct?
Well, again, I'm nervous to say that it was 100% pure, but definitely it is accurate to say it has been corrupted over time. So whatever the level, the percentage of purity was, like ivory soap at the beginning, it's much less pure now. So I think for sure you're right about that. And of course, it's interesting to think about what drives that. I do think at some level, as Baha'is, we understand that to be the lack of the spiritual dimension. That if you reduce this to a materialistic exercise, it's I want power and I want influence and I want the wealth that comes from power and influence. And if that's the exercise, of course, it's going to be the case that, what is it? Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? So the more you make this about power, the more corrupt it's going to become. Now, to be fair, it's worth noting some of this has, in our lifetimes, gotten much worse, right? So it is the case that decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court around the notion that donations are an exercise of free speech and therefore are not easily subject to regulation, has allowed the amount of money that flows into elections to become astronomical. I mean, it's a crazy, the number, it blows your mind, the amount of money that's being spent on an election. And then the next day it's done, right? And then you go on, all that money is gone. So I do think, again, there are ways in which we have made it worse over time. But if I'm speaking honestly, I would say the moment you say this is about, that you disconnect our goals from spiritual aspirations to advance our common weal, the common good of society, you begin to you start down the path of that corruption. And it's just a question of how far down the path you end up going.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So much. Dr. Adi, I have in follow-up to my first questions for the lack of recognition and then introduction of just the Baha'i for themselves. Then this one automatically it has generated already an algorithm that on election, we do not see any changes on the members of the assembly. So it means no matter how you do it, this one is going to remain the same. And then some Baha'is, and this one is another fire back. Another thing is the Baha'is thinking that, okay, why should I go and vote? We know the result. So do you have any opinion on this?
Good. So one thing I mentioned, the data that I shared, that actually, and this is self-written 10, 15 years ago. So I don't know if anyone has updated the data, but at least over a 10, 15, 20-year stretch, what they found was that actually was declining over time. Even when the same individuals won, they won with 30% or 40% or 50% versus 60 or 70 or 80%. So that bodes well for the idea that it's not so fixed. Piece number one. Piece number two, actually, anecdotally, we do have, in the last 20 years, we have had individuals who were elected and then were not elected in not necessarily a year later, but at some point were not elected. As sometime before they actively resigned or retired or moved away or something like this, they think. So we do have some examples of that, but I do think that's a real risk. And that's where I think that my view is, and this is, I don't know that there's grounding in this, except that there is this outcome that I shared of turnover. There is, if you look at the Baha'i writings on elections, it does talk about the value of new ideas, fresh blood, whatever else it is. Now, again, that can't descend into don't vote for Fred. He's been on there too long. We cannot, that's the boundary, right? But short of that, I don't know that consultation about the value of new perspectives and new ideas, consultation about making sure that the youth are represented. I think, and again, this is, this is why as Baha'is we consult. I think that all of that is permissible, and the idea is that then shapes hopefully how people think about how they're going to vote, what they're going to do in that regard. And then again, I would reiterate what I told you earlier, what I said earlier, that I do think that, between regional councils and area teaching committees and the role of the learned branch, auxiliary board members, assistants to the auxiliary board, so on and so forth. I think we have mechanisms in place that bring other individuals to the fore in a way that I hope that over time we see more about. But if we're being honest, remember, we are, the Baha'i writings talk about, we're in the infancy of all of this, right? It's not all that long ago. Frankly, it's not much more than 100 years. 100 years ago, very little of what I've talked about tonight existed in practice. It may have existed on paper, and it may have existed in some places. So 100 years is pretty short. Remember, the United States is 250 years. So relatively speaking, we're pretty new to this. And so I think some of that will be, as we mature, there will also be more consultation again, more engagement. And again, that consultation piece, I don't think it has to wait for maturity, but we do have to find a way to, oftentimes as Baha'is, there's a tendency to overcorrect, I'll call it. So we are not allowed to engage in campaigning or electioneering or any of this stuff. And so it's not appropriate to say anything about what we should look for in members of the assembly. I think that's incorrect. I don't think that the writings actually support that. I think that's a totally appropriate thing, as long as, again, we don't allow it to descend into personalities.
Thank you so much. Okay, one of our friends sent a question by text. It says, what is the wisdom behind the fact that there is no term limit in Baha'i election?
Yeah. So again, I said it earlier, and again, but let me first mention before I get to that. So I was, as a lawyer, in my very early days as a lawyer, involved in some of the litigation around term limits. And in the non-Baha'i context, the general principle was, it was a political conversation about, new blood and so on and so forth, and a loss of experience on the other side, and so on. In the Baha'i context, the way I interpret, or the way I understand it, is that it comes back to this freedom of conscience, that it should be the case that every Baha'i is free to vote for whoever it is that they would believe best. And it should not be the case that I cannot vote for you because you've already been on there 10 years or 5 years or 15 years or whatever else it is. That's how I interpret the source of the principle, is that we would be violating the freedom of conscience of individuals to vote for the individuals whom they wish to vote for. But look, it is the case that as Baha'is, we understand everything as a matter of systems, and so that works within a system in which the overall system is producing sufficient turnover and so on and so forth. Can I imagine a world in which at some point, and again, I have to go back and look what was the source and what was the phrasing of the language of we don't have term limits. Can I imagine a world in which, if that doesn't change, perhaps there are term limits in 50 years or something? Sure, it's possible. Again, I'd want to go back and look at the text to see what's the nature of it precisely. But I would say, again, there is a good principle, and the principle is you should be able to vote for whoever you think is best. And if that's the person who's been on there 20 years, God bless, go vote for that person. And others should be able to vote for the new blood that they, whatever else it is. But again, that principle, I think, works best within a system in which there is also a value, there is also a separate principle of new perspectives, new thoughts, new generation, new whatever else it is.
Thank you. Dr. Ahdieh, looks like tonight I asked so many questions from you.
Yeah, that's okay. That's
I promise this is the last one. I based on the existing and current type administration law, Baha'i law that we have, assume that we're going through the number of Baha'is expand largely, and then we coming up with for the elections of I don't know, city mayor or officials, I don't know, just mayors and judge or something. So how you think that one can be implemented? Is it that one can be implemented or no? This is the totally separate system parallel to each other.
Well, I don't think there's a notion. If you go to Shoghi Effendi's writings, I don't recall anything that suggests the evolution of the Baha'i world order is that eventually the mayor will be elected using the same process. I don't think that's the case. That doesn't mean it can't be like that, right? So there's nothing forbidding it. But I don't read the framing of the Baha'i electoral process as being eventually we will take what we're doing with assemblies and translate it to the mayor of Fort Worth or the mayor of New York or the mayor of Los Angeles. Again, it could be that, could be not. That's where, to me, again, I would say it as what is it that the election of the mayor of Los Angeles can learn from what we do as Baha'is, right? What is it about how we vote, how we campaign, how we nominate or don't nominate individuals, the breadth of eligibility to be included. That's where, again, that's where I think the action will lie. You can also think about this a different way. At some point, we hope. I don't know. I'm saying Los Angeles because many of you are on the West Coast. But in Los Angeles, when there are 2 million Baha'is, I'm picking the number. It's not 10 million Baha'is, but 2 million Baha'is. It's the case that you can imagine. Then that becomes a source of, well, there are 2 million citizens of this city who have a certain perspective on what elections are and how they and their purpose and their values and so on and so forth. We may not adopt their electoral mechanism, but we sure as heck need to learn from it and borrow from it, right? And that's the way I could imagine that the mayor of the city, some of these things that we've talked about tonight get translated into practice.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ahdieh. Friends, I was talking to Dr. Ahdieh about the timing, and we picked the time a little bit earlier for him to that actually can rest because it was it is late in East Coast. And Dr. Ahdieh was the cause. Actually, I designed the system that maybe in future for those friends who they are coming from East Coast, we start the program at 6:30 our time, California time, in order just to give more room for sleep of the speakers when they're coming from East Coast. But thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it. And we really learn a lot from you. And hopefully we can see you in the future in other programs. Thank you.
I hope so.
Thank you. Thank you.